Hello everyone, my name is Tiffany Tran and I'm an assistant engineer in the Planning and Environmental Resources Department. So today I will be going over the air quality compliance training. Feel free to ask any questions throughout the presentation because I think it would be useful if we had more of a discussion throughout the presentation. So in today's presentation, I will be going over what is the South Coast Air Quality Management District, what is an AQMD permit, how to ensure that we are maintaining compliance 100% of the time, and common causes of violations. I'll then talk about what you can expect when we do have an inspection from AQMD. So the South Coast Air Quality Management District is the air pollution control agency that regulates stationary sources of air pollution. And stationary sources refers to fixed sources of emissions such as the wastewater treatment process, engines, boilers, flares, etc. And because of our densely populated basin and our geography, we do have one of the most smoggiest air in the nation. Therefore, we do have really strict emission limits and requirements that we do have to comply with. So what is an AQMD permit? It's basically a written paper issued by the AQMD that would allow you to construct, install, alter, replace, or operate any equipment that emits or controls air contaminants. It's important to know that even air controls would require permits if necessary. And I've stored all the AQMD permits on the link below, but I will eventually be moving the permits to the AIM for better access and convenience, but I'll let you know once that's complete, and I'll ask for feedback. So a permit is required for equipment and processes that emit or control air contaminants. These are generally large internal combustion engines greater than 50 brake horsepower. It could even be for processes such as a wastewater treatment process, controls such as biofilters, scrubbers. Even if we do have projects on site that would require contractors to bring out temporary equipment, for example, engines that are greater than 50 brake horsepower, it's important that we do verify that the unit they bring on site do have a permit, mainly because if AQMD is on site, they really like to look at temporary equipment because it's an easy way for them to issue you a notice to comply or notice of violation if that unit does not have a permit. So it's important that if there's any work performed on site, please let compliance know for us to verify that the contractors do have the required permits. However, AQMD recognizes that not all equipment needs to be permitted, especially if they're not a major source of emissions. So equipment listed in AQMD Rule 219 do not need to be permitted. However, some equipment do have filing and record keeping requirements. So examples would be smaller boilers, smaller engines. Abrasive blast cabinets is a good example of a equipment if it does meet certain dimensions that do not need to be permitted, but they do have record keeping requirements such as recording the date of when maintenance was performed. So if you have any questions on whether or not a unit needs to be permitted, please let me know, or you could always refer to this rule or I could help you out. So there are two main permit types. The first one is the permit to construct. It is required before installing new or relocated equipment or before modifying any existing equipment. And modification refers to both physical modifications, such as adding a diesel particulate filter to an emergency engine. And modification could also refer to a change of operating conditions, such as increasing throughput to the facility. The second type of permit is the permit to operate, and this is when AQMD processes your permit to construct for a permit to operate. So basically in a permit to construct, there is a condition where compliance would have to notify AQMD once the installation or modification has been complete. And once we give them that notification, your permit to construct would serve as your temporary permit to operate. In the meantime, AQMD would remove any unnecessary conditions that were more applicable for the construction phase and may include more record-keeping requirements in your permit to operate. So these are the general components of a permit. Each permit includes the equipment description, identification numbers, permit conditions, which include but are not limited to operating conditions, throughput limits, emission limits, record-keeping requirements, performance test, and they include the rule in which the condition is citing. So I'll go over 2 examples of a permit, and I'll point out examples of permit conditions. So this is permit example number 1. This is the permit for the RP5 wastewater treatment plant. On the right, you will see the equipment ID. So whenever we're talking about a certain permit, please give me both ID numbers, the permit application number and the application number, so that we are talking about the most revised permit. So below that, you will see the equipment description, and under the equipment description lists the components associated with the equipment. And compliance is working with AQMD to simplify our permit conditions so that we do have more operational flexibility. And generally in a permit description, you will see the make, model, and dimensions. So this is the second page.
Can you go back one slide? Let's see here. 9A.
Mm-hmm.
2 anode polymer totes, each 260 gallons. Does that mean we have to have that on site?
No, we don't. So if you look in Rule 219, any salt-based chemicals are actually exempt from a written permit, which means they actually do not need to be permitted. So we are working with AQMD to just include the types of chemicals that we may use at the facility, but don't include any capacities. But if an inspector is on site and they ask, okay, show me the storage tank, why does it not match with what's on the permit, they can't issue you a notice of violation because it doesn't even need a permit anyways. So that's why compliance is working to remove any unnecessary equipments to, so that we don't have to constantly open the permit again just to update capacities. But let me know if there's anything you would like to streamline, and I'll double check Rule 219 to see if we can make that happen.
Okay, no, that's fine. The reason I called that one to attention is because we had that station removed.
Mm-hmm.
So the polymer totes, the pumps, the associated equipment have all been decommissioned.
Yeah, I think in the permit application that was submitted several years ago removed that condition, that equipment description, but we have not received the final permit. But in the draft permit that AQMD gave me, they removed the chemical capacities and just listed the general chemicals names. So this is the second page of the wastewater treatment plant permit. The first 3 conditions are standard conditions found for all of our permits. It's basically that we need to keep our equipment in good operating condition at all times, and that the equipment must be operated by trained personnel. So condition number 4 is a really good example of an operating requirement in which we can't operate these processes unless they are vented to the biofilter. Number 5 is a good example of a record-keeping requirement in which we are required to record the total influent flow to the plant. Condition 6 is a good example of a throughput limit in which the influent flow to RP5 cannot exceed 12 mgd. We're still waiting for the permit from AQMD, which would allow us to take in 16.3 mgd. But since we have not received our final permit, we cannot take in that much flow. So we're still stuck with 12 mgd until we receive our final permit.
So just a reminder, so operationally, as much as possible, we want to comply with this. However, depending on circumstances with RP1 and Carbon Canyon, if those circumstances dictate that we have to exceed that 12 mgd, we do, and we notify Tiffany, and we deal with the repercussions. Now, that's not a practice we want to implement if it's not necessary, but if we need it, we can exceed it.
But it's important, that's a good point, and it's also important that if it does occur, immediately notify compliance so that we could take the proper steps to report it to AQMD and follow the rules. And the last condition for all permits generally list how long records must be maintained for. So for RP5, it's for 5 years. I chose a second example to be the emergency internal combustion engine, mainly because they are found at all of our plants. And I wanted to draw your attention to condition number 3, which indicates the amount of hours allocated for maintenance and testing. Don't assume that all engines have the same amount of hours allocated for maintenance and testing. So for example, RP5 only has 6 hours, whereas RP4 may have 20 hours. And under condition number 4, I've just circled the rule in which the condition is referencing. So if you ever wonder how we got a condition, you can always refer to the rule or ask me. Number 7 indicates the record keeping requirements, and number 10 indicates the emission limits. So it's really important to know your permit and to frequently review the permit. I've made know your permits for the south facilities, and it serves as your cheat sheet, but it's always good to always refer to the permit for the full language. So from this slide, I wanted everyone to know that permit conditions for even similar or identical equipment are not always the same. The permit conditions ultimately depend on the type of facility. So for our facilities, we have 2 types categorized by AQMD. The first is the Title V facilities, which are major sources of emissions. So these are RP1, RP5, and IRCF. These facilities typically have more record-keeping requirements and reporting requirements, as well as strict emission limits. For the other facilities, such as RP2, RP4, Carbon Canyon, and CDA, these are referred to non-Title V facilities because they are minor sources of emissions. So they don't have as many record-keeping requirements and reporting requirements to follow as compared to the Title V facilities. Your permit conditions ultimately also depend on whether or not there are sensitive receptors nearby the equipment. And sensitive receptors are typically schools, residences, and prisons. So a good example would be for RP1, the emergency engine at T plant. Because it is within 100 meters of the Montecito Baptist School, we're not allowed to operate the engine for maintenance and testing during school hours, while other engines, such as the ones at RP5, since we're not nearby any sensitive receptors, we are allowed to operate the engine for maintenance and testing at any time, as long as we don't exceed the allocated amount per year. Record keeping is a major component in order to demonstrate whether or not our facilities are in compliance. They are required by our permit conditions. So for example, the treatment plant, we are required to record the total flow of wastewater treated per day. For our facilities that do handle digester gas, like RP2 and RP5 solids, we are required to record the amount of digester gas combusted in each combustion equipment. And for our biofilter RP5, we are required to record surface H2S concentrations. And these records are inspected during an AQMD inspection, and they may be requested by AQMD at any time to verify compliance. I heavily rely on your records in order to complete reports to the regulatory agencies. So in this case, it would be to the AQMD and EPA. So a good example would be for our Title V facilities, which are RP1, RP5, and IERCF. I have to submit a report, one for the January to end of June monitoring period, and another report from the July to December monitoring period. And the purpose of this report is to identify all instances of permit deviations, which means failure to comply with a permit term. So for example, at RP5, if we did not perform the smoke test every 6 months, I would have to include that in the report. And basically the report includes what was the incident, how long it lasted, which permit conditions and rules were violated, and whether or not those rules were federally enforceable. I'll also have to discuss about the cause and whether or not it was a result from operator error, neglect, improper operation, or maintenance procedures. And I'll have to discuss the steps taken to correct the problem and prevent future incidents. That's why whenever there is a deviation from the permit condition, it's very important to let compliance know, because we do want to minimize the amount of time the incident lasted for, whether it is to implement new corrective actions or to do more frequent training to new operators that may not be familiar with the permit. Unlike last year, I'd like to talk more about incident reporting, and these slides are very important for our Title V facilities, again, RP5, RP1, and IERCF, but it's also good for the non-Title V facilities to be aware of. So for Title V facilities, we do have to report all permit deviations somehow, and it ultimately depends on the type of deviation, and deviations could be broken down into 4 different types. And based on the types, they do have different deadlines for the verbal report that needs to be made to AQMD. And some doesn't even require any verbal report to AQMD, but I'll discuss the examples later on. And later you will find a slide with a table that indicates the timeline in which compliance would have to notify AQMD. So the first type, and from this slide, I just want everyone to know that reporting is time sensitive, and I'll discuss the importance of reporting on time, and that compliance will be responsible for contacting AQMD. So let us know if there's an issue, and then we'll make the call out to AQMD. So the first type of incident reporting is the emergency, and this is caused by sudden unforeseeable events such as floods, earthquakes, etc., beyond our control, which would require immediate corrective action to restore normal operation and causes the facility to exceed an emission limitation, and that it's not caused by improperly designed equipment, lack of preventative maintenance, or careless operation. The second type of deviation is the most common for our facilities, and this is the breakdown. And breakdowns are caused by accidental fires or non-preventable mechanical or electrical failure, which results in violation of any rule or permit condition. And this is why reporting from compliance to AQMD in a timely manner is important, mainly because if we do follow the steps correctly and we do mitigate the emissions, AQMD cannot issue us a notice of violation because we followed the proper steps per Rule 430. So that's why if there's a digester gas venting that occurs at our facility, immediately contact compliance, because we have within 1 hour of your discovery to make a verbal call to AQMD. And AQMD inspector, when we do make a call out to AQMD, they generally like to follow up with the incident, whether it is going to the facility to inspect the equipment associated with the breakdown, or they could even call us to find out more information. And at the end of their inspection, they would let us know if the incident shall be given relief. So a good example of an incident in which we would have to report under as a breakdown would be any digester gas venting events that occur at RP5 or RP2. Examples of digester gas venting may be caused by ruptured digester gas line flex hose or digester gas foaming. The next type of deviation is known as the excess emissions, and these are any monitoring tests required or observations in which the emissions exceed the permit or applicable rules. So for all of our facilities, this would be if our throughput exceeds the throughput limit, mainly because, for example, for our wastewater treatment plants, if we exceed our permitted limit influent flow to the plant, that would be an increase of VOC emissions. For RP5, an example of excess emissions would be if the H2S measurement on the biofilter exceeds 1 ppmv. For RP5 and RP2, excess emissions would be if the facility emits 5 or more pounds of H2S. And carbon canyon would be if our scrubber exhaust emissions for H2S exceeds 2.5 ppmv. All other deviations are captured under this category, and these are generally deviations that do not involve emissions. So an example would be at RP5, for example, if we fail to perform the biofilter smoke test. So here was a table I was talking about earlier, and it lists the deadline in which compliance would have to make a verbal report, if applicable, to AQMD, and when the written reports are due. So from this slide, it's important to know that for breakdowns that involve equipment that have failed and there wasn't excess emissions, immediately try to fix the problem, make sure that everyone's safe before doing so, and immediately notify your supervisor or deputy manager. Once you are able to verify that the digester gas venting occurred based on reviewing digester gas trends, immediately contact compliance, and compliance would have within 1 hour of your discovery to make a call to AQMD. And for other deviations that do not involve excess emissions, these are for Title V facilities. No verbal report is required, but we do have to report that in the semi-annual monitoring report. So a good example of a incident reporting would be digester gas venting at RP2. So this would be a violation of the sewage treatment plant permit, in which condition number 9 requires raw digester gas shall not be vented to the atmosphere. So for the verbal report, it's important to provide compliance with basic details such as the location, the equipment involved with the venting incident, cause if you do know what happened, but if you don't, it's fine. We'll just write it up in the written report and the date and time. So a good example would be an actual incident that occurred in 2012, and digester gas venting occurred due to excess foaming of the digester caused by partial blockage of the digester gas discharge line, which resulted in the opening of the PVRV. So for the written report, we would mention the duration. For this case, it happened about 40 minutes. The emissions, approximately 0.059 pounds of H2S. Probable cause, which was excessive foaming of the digester. And for preventative action, we indicated that we would reevaluate the digester mixing cycle to minimize excess foaming. So that's generally an example of a type of report that we would submit. And before we do submit the report to AQMD, we will send it out to you guys to make sure we have the facts correct and to get your input.
Tiffany, on that, would we add if the incident has been mitigated or if it's still going on?
Yeah.
We report to you, right?
We would also have to indicate that in the report. Yeah. So I'd like to talk about common causes of violations. These are issued by the AQMD inspector, and common causes are constructing or operating an equipment without obtaining a permit. And it's important to know that deviations from permit condition does not always mean it's going to result in a violation. It ultimately depends on the inspector and the case, but generally deviations that do involve excess emissions is an easy way for AQMD to issue a notice of violation. Also, complaints received by AQMD, whether it is nuisance caused by fugitive dust or odors, can lead to a notice of violation. So when AQMD receives a call from someone complaining about the odors, that would trigger AQMD to head out to our facilities to try to match the odor that they were given to what they smelled at the plants. And if AQMD can verify that the complaints are valid and it is coming from our plants, they just need 6 to 10 verified complaints for the day in order for them to issue a public notice of violation. So a good example would be the Porter Ranch incident. AQMD received a lot of odor complaints, and that was an easy way for AQMD to issue SoCal Gas a notice of violation. Also, when we do make verbal reports to AQMD, whether it is caused by a breakdown or excess emissions, that can trigger AQMD to come out to do an inspection of the equipment associated with the breakdown or excess emissions. And that's a really easy way for them to decide to perform a facility-wide inspection. So it's important to know that verbal reports can lead to inspections of our facilities. So to ensure that our facilities are in compliance, compliance will be performing internal audits once a year at least. And basically what we will do is act as if we are AQMD, and we want to walk around the facility to make sure that the equipment description on the permits match with what's actually at the facility. And if it does not match, compliance will be responsible for submitting an application to fix the permit. We also like to make sure that the permits are posted nearby the equipment and also assess the condition of the equipment. We also want to make sure that equipment on site have been permitted if needed, and that contractors, when they do come out, have permitted equipments with their units. We'll also be reviewing operating logs. So in essence, we're going to act like an AQMD inspector. So inspections by AQMD are generally unannounced, but for our Title V facilities, which are RP1, RP5, and ERCF, it's guaranteed that we will have an inspection from AQMD at least once a year, and it generally happens around the summertime. For all other facilities, RP2, RP4, Carbon Canyon, and CDA, which are non-Title V facilities, AQMD can come anytime, but it's important to know that whenever we do make a verbal report to AQMD, that can trigger them to head out to the facility. So if the inspector is on site, immediately contact your supervisor and or deputy manager, and then contact compliance. Don't begin the inspection until compliance is at the facility so that we can facilitate with the inspection. And what you can expect when there is an inspection, generally the inspector will basically review our permits. They'll have certain record-keeping records they want to request for and equipments they want to look at. And they also want to discuss about our compliance history. I've noticed that when we do have an inspector on site, they really do like to look at the combustion units, whether it is by taking a picture of the totalizer and making sure that it matches with what's in the record book. They also like to tour the facility to observe any processes or employee practices. So this concludes my presentation, and if you have any questions with regards to air quality compliance, please let me know, or Pietro or Sylvie, and we would be happy to help out. Thanks.
Hey, Tiffany, do we have an update on RP2 engine yet? Are we still waiting for a final decision?
I believe we're still waiting for a final decision.
On your first slide, you had I believe it might have been section 8, dealing with the UV processes and everything else. Is that amended, and why is it still on there?
So this is a permit, this is our old permit from 2015. We did submit an application a few years ago to remove that since it's no longer at our facility. But AQMD is taking a while in reviewing the permit, but in their draft permit, they removed it. So in our final permit, we should not expect to see that.
So while we've got the full compliance crew here, any other compliance and or permit related questions for anything?
I have a question. How many air complaints does the south part of the district get on average per month or per year?
We haven't received any this year, because generally, if they do receive one, I believe AQMD would contact us to let us know about it. And also when we do have an inspection, the yearly inspection, the inspector would tell you how many complaints they've received. And on the last inspection, they didn't mention any complaints received.
Anything else?